My name is Samuel Donato. I have a middle initial or a middle name, but that really is a confirmation name. It's not a legal name, and it's Arthur. Samuel Arthur Donato, SAD for sad. And of course, I never tried to be sad. I try to avoid sad things. I was born on June the 3rd, 1929. I was named after my godfather, whose name was Samuel Arthur Donato. So Samuel Arthur Donato was my uncle. He was my godfather as well. And so when I made my confirmation, I had to choose a middle name for my confirmation. And that choice is left up to the individual, totally up to the individual. And I chose Arthur because I thought that my godfather was just the cat's meow. I mean, he was just a wonderful guy, always had me laughing, always had me joking, never made me feel inferior, never bossed me around, always was just a nice guy. If he needed something, he would ask. If I asked him for something, he would tell me if he could or if he couldn't. And so throughout my life, I always wanted to fashion myself after Uncle Sam, just to be that kind of guy. Let's talk about the immigration story. We had two grandparent groups coming over from Italy. The maternal grandparents and paternal grandparents. My father's parents and his brother and sister originally came over from Italy, in the year 1905. My father was 4 years old at the time. He came over with my grandfather and grandmother and brother and sister, uh, primarily to make a new location because of freedom, uh, because they didn't feel the freedom in Italy that they felt they should have. There were two ships involved. There were two ships that carried them over. The first one was called the Perugia. Perugia means rain, but that was the name of the ship, and it came out of Naples. It was owned by the Italian line, and that was the first ship that my grandfather and my father and his family came over on. That ship, they traveled reasonably well. They were not in steerage, probably because my grandfather had a farm, a chestnut farm, and was able to put some money away and be able to pay his way. My mother came over on the Rex. The Rex, her original, the only time she came, and the Rex was a very big ship, very well known in Italy and throughout the United States as well, because it transported so many immigrants. When my mother came, they came, as she told me, in steerage. Steerage being the lowest level that you can get on a ship. As long as you're on the ship, though, you know you're going to get there. So that's what she was looking for. They all came through Ellis Island. Yes, and they're all recorded there. My brother made it a point to have that recorded in the final booklets on Ellis Island. And so they all came through Ellis Island. I've never heard any stories about Ellis Island, except that it was very well organized. Everything worked well. They came through. There was no antagonism, no threats, nothing like that. Everything was just very pleasant. And everything that they had imagined about the United States was shown when they came to Ellis Island as a very nice place to come. My mother was Philomena. That's what she was born as and christened as, and that was her birth certificate. But when she came to the United States, she changed it to Fanny. She didn't feel like walking around with being called Philomena all the time. So her name was Fanny. My mother was the second oldest daughter of her parents. Her parents ultimately had 11 children. Of those 11 children, 10 survived, 4 boys, 6 girls. My mother ran the household. My grandmother apparently was always sickly. My mother ran the household completely. Food, cleaning, directing the kids, what to do, who to do it, and how to do it. And she learned very quickly that running the ship was not easy and a very lonely kind of activity, because you make the decisions and that's what you've made them. Her father was not the most involved in the family. Probably was distant, to say the least. So he was not helpful. So my mother ran the show with my grandmother's guidance. But my grandmother was sick all that time. But my mother, at that point, stayed home with her husband, right, and had 3 children. They lived at 119th Street, then 120th, and back to 119th Street until I was 5 years old. My sister was born the year after they got married, my brother 2 years later, and me 3 years later. So somewhere around 1930, we moved into the Bronx. went to 147th Street, and my mother kept the household there. While she kept the household there, she also worked. She was a crochet beater. She was a member of the ILGWU, International Lady Garment Workers Union. And she worked for a small concern and enjoyed it no end. She was always busy because she did what's known as crochet beading. So she would get a handbag and bead the whole handbag, or she would take a gown and put beading on the gown. She would design the bead structure, or she would just follow somebody else's design. I was about 4 years old, and the Rockefeller Christmas tree was being put up. That was just in the beginning years. And my mother said, "Come to work with me, and then we'll go to see the tree." And so I went to work with her. And she was working on 33rd Street in the garment workers area. And we went up to the 10th floor or thereabouts. I remember standing by the window looking down and saying, "Oh, those people look like ants," walking around there. We left there and we went to Rockefeller Center. First time I was ever there. And there was the tree, and the workmen were putting it up, and you could see what was going to come out, in the long run. I was so happy about that. Many years later, when I got a chance to work at NBC or at Rockefeller Center, I went there, and I worked for Standard Oil. I loved it. Many years after that, I went to NBC and worked there. All that started with my mother. My mother liked to do things. She liked to have people. She enjoyed getting work done, whatever it was. She enjoyed watching her kids grow up. She was so proud when I went to college, because I was the first one ever went to college. And my mother, as grandchildren started to come, a whole different world. The grandchildren, she loved every one of them. She knew how to deal with them. She knew how to guide them, how to help them. When they went to visit with her, she had them working all the time. It followed something she did with me when I was a kid. I said to her one day, "I'm bored," and she said, "Oh, well, I got something for you to do. Come on in." She taught me how to clean a toilet bowl. There I was bored, and she taught. And you know what? I walked away. I had a new skill, something I never did before. Right? At other times, she put me to work peeling potatoes, but that was a lesson. My father's name was Carmine Anthony Donato. That was his legal name. That was his baptismal name. That was his birth name. Nobody ever knew him by the name of Carmine Anthony Donato. Everybody only knew him as Tony or Anthony, but they always used the word Tony. Or they called him Red because he had red hair. He was just a nice guy. He was, as I may have mentioned before, not afraid of anything. Things did not scare him. He was not a big man, except when he carried his trumpet, and no matter where he went, everybody respected him. He carried his trumpet like the best trumpeter around. He could play anything. He'd play, whether it be classical with Toscanini, or jazz with Eddie Duchin, or just commercial weddings or celebrations, parades. He would do all of that. My grandmother was a dynamo. She was about 4'6", 4'8", but she would always be moving, and she'd always be doing things. Always a very, very pleasant lady who got things done and moved them along very nicely. She helped my mother when my mother had a nervous breakdown. and she was just a nice person. My grandfather, he was a quiet guy. When he was younger, he was very dynamic. The stories are about him that he was in the Tunisian War with Italy, fighting on the Italian side. He was in the foxholes while they were fighting, and he did that for a year and a half. Went through very difficult food problems because they were in Africa. They were not in Italy, and they didn't have the food, the same kind of food, and the importing of the food became very hard. But nonetheless, he lasted that out, came home, got an honorable discharge, became a merchant marine, and went around the world. On the other side of family, on my mother's side, I never knew my grandmother. I don't ever remember meeting her. I know that she was ill for the most part of her life, that my mother took care of the household to make sure that everything was going good. My mother was the second in age and was quite good in the kitchen, and as well as making sure that everybody did their jobs. Because with a lot of people in the house, everybody had to do their job. So they made their beds, and she made sure they made their beds. They picked up their wash and all that sort of business. But my grandmother, on my mother's side, I didn't know her at all. My grandfather, I got to meet at the wake of my grandmother. My grandmother died when she was 50. She had cancer. My grandfather was there, and his son Calvin, who was at that time 17, and I was 13, so we related to some degree, also because we looked very much alike. My uncle Calvin introduced me to my grandfather. My grandfather, over the next few years, I would see from time to time. My father, in 1947, I believe that was the date, in 1947, decided that he wanted to become a citizen, but he wanted to represent himself as Donato because the name Di Donato was old world, was not new world. And he was in the music business, and he was well known, and they called him Tony D, so it was Tony Donato. So he wanted that change, and so in 1947 he had that done. He had to have some certifications made, affidavits derived. My older brother developed an affidavit, submitted it on his behalf. That's why the name changed from Di Donato to Donato. I started when I was about 5. My father wanted me to learn music. So he took a book that was called Solfeggio. It's a book that's still used now in many of the music places, music schools. And from time I was 5 until I was 10, he would have me go through various portions of it to learn how to read music and understand it, to divide the music, and even he would show me how to conduct. In doing that, I learned what music was about. When I was finished at 10 years old with solfeggio, my father handed me his trumpet, and he said, work on this for a couple of days. I worked on it for one night, and I gave it back. I said, Pop, it's not for me. A couple of years later, my sister was a girl. Therefore, girls play the piano. So he got a piano for her, and they brought the piano to the 5th floor of the apartment house by having a tackle off the roof, and they pulled the piano up, took out the window, put it through the window, carried it through the... Anyhow, there we had the piano, and my sister took lessons for 6 months. She hated every minute, and I loved every minute. So there came a time when she didn't want to do it. I said, okay, You don't do it, but I'll do it. So she told my mother that she didn't want to play piano, but Sammy did. So, okay, so the lessons went to me, and I took a book, and I could read it, and I started playing from her book because I understood how to make the transitions. My father, in his network, had a classical pianist whose name was Donato, first name. So Donato, first name, pianist, on Arthur Avenue in the Bronx, right? So I went there to Arthur Avenue, took the elevated train to Arthur Avenue, went there once a week for about 2 years. After that, my father moved me to another one of his network, a band pianist. Name was Basso. And so Mr. Basso taught me, or introduced me to Mozart, Beethoven, and Chopin. My childhood, from 5 years old on, included some time in Manhattan, where I still lived at 119th Street and 119th Street between Pleasant and First Avenue, right across the street from Holy Rosary Church. And I used to go to Holy Rosary Church and had Monsignor Archesi, who was the chief of that, or who was the pastor of that church. And he was a sweet guy, always very pleasant to all the kids. And whenever we had a Sunday Mass, he'd walk up and down the aisles and talk to all the kids. And they would react, and I would react, and it was a very nice setting. One day I went out to early in the morning for breakfast, not for breakfast, after breakfast. The whole area at the time was lacking in cars. Maybe one car a day would run up and down the block, or 2 cars. There would be no cars parked on the street. Coal trucks carrying coal to go into the coal bins of the various houses would be there. And we would run around the streets doing various things like playing marbles, tag, things of that sort. And one afternoon, while we're playing tag, I'm running across the street, never looking to the right where the coal truck is coming. All of a sudden, I hear brakes and bum, 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 bum. I turn around and there is the coal truck. I had run right in front of the coal truck. It would have killed me, except that the driver was so competent and capable, and the truck was in good shape. Of course, all the coal from the top of the truck came off. That's where all the little bounces were. And all of a sudden, you see all the little old ladies coming out with their buckets, picking up the coal. So they cleaned up the street, but they took all the coal with them, and they left. My mother, hearing that screech, looked out the window, because our apartment at that time was overlooking 119th. Was looking overlooking the street, right? She looks out, she sees me there, and she screams, right? Because she saw me in that kind of situation. And so I went home, and she paddled me. A woman's paddle, it's like peanuts, right? But nonetheless, it made me realize that I had to be a lot more careful. That year, a friend or a new guy came into school. His name was Mike. Mike came from Italy, from Bari, Italy. His father was Frank. He was the Iceman. Mike and I became friends because Mike could not speak English too well, and we were in an area at that time which had more non-Italians than Italians. because we had moved from 119th Street to 147th Street. And Mike and I became friends because he needed to have a friend. And I thought, poor kid is all by himself, right? So we started to talk and we became friends. And he invited me to the ice shop. And I went to the ice shop with him. And he showed me how he cut the ice, how he delivered the ice, how he split rails, like Abe Lincoln split rails, how he split rails. And he taught me how to do all that stuff. It really was a lot of fun. It was my first job. I was 10 and a half years old at that time. And it was my first job, and I got paid by tips. So if I delivered to this little old lady's apartment, putting the ice on the dumbwaiter and pulling the dumbwaiter up to the third floor, then going up to the third and taking the ice out and putting it into the ice box. And she'd give me 2 cents. That was my money. My own money. I learned how to save money at that point in time. That was my first job. During that same period of time, walking along the streets, I would look for any monies that dropped in the grates, because there were grates where you walked, and those grates opened up to basements where furnaces were and provided aeration for the furnaces. But they also provided a good catching pot for people who dropped coins. So one day walking through, not one day, a number of days walking through, I saw coins down there. And I still remember a day when it was a quarter. Now, a quarter was one hell of a lot of money at the time. A nickel was a lot, but a quarter, that's 5 times as much. So I had a piece of bubble gum, which I chewed until it was as sticky as could be, put it at the end of a piece of rope or cord with a rock on the end so it would hold, and lowered it down and went down about 15 feet, and I got that quarter and pulled it up. I was as rich as could be. I was as happy as could. I took that quarter and I went down to the corner, and I could get 10 pieces of candy for a penny. So I got 50 pieces of candy, and I still had money left over. I went home and I told my mother. My mother said, "Wonderful. How much are you going to put away?" I said, "What do you mean put away?" She said, "You always put money away for a rainy day. So how much you got left over? How much you going to put away?" I said, "Not a bad idea. Put money away for a rainy day." So I took my 20 cents, and if I remember correctly, I put 10 cents away for a rainy day. And I used that at a time in the future. I found that so very interesting, that if you work and you put some money away all the time, just a little bit, that at one point you're going to have a lot of money. The first school I went to was PS 78 in Manhattan. I went there for first grade, and that was on 119th Street and Pleasant Avenue. I don't know if it's still there, but it was a great big school. I liked that school. I liked the people there. One of the things I found interesting was that in first grade, when they got to numbers, I knew all the numbers. I never had a problem with the numbers. I liked it. The people were nice. The school was nice. I made it through, and I was able to move from PS 78 to PS 27. PS 27 was in the Bronx. That's where I went. That was on 147th Street where I lived. And PS 27 was an elementary school. And that school was very nice. I learned a lot there. When I was in second grade, Mrs. Rothbaum and Mrs. Fay took a liking to me and thought that maybe I could sing. And so I became the boy soprano and the hero in the operetta three pirates came to London town. So I sang as the father of the three girls who were being stolen by those three pirates. Well, I enjoyed that no end. And my mother and I talked about that, what I was going to do. And she suggested something to me that when I went in before the whole PTA and the school was packed and the auditorium was packed, and I got up there and I sang the closing song. Three pirates came to London town to see the king put on his crown. Yo ho, your lovers, yo ho, your lovers, yo ho, yo ho, yo ho. Three pirates came to London town and took my three girls away. And I pull out a handkerchief that's 16 feet long out of my back pocket, red. And I take the end and put it to my eye. Well, the place breaks up. It was hilarious. My mother called that one just perfectly. So as a result of that, for the next 4 years, I was the image of the music department because there I could sing. I was a boy soprano. I was superb. Let me tell you about junior high school. Junior high school, I went to the choir because I had sung in elementary school. And the choir director said to me, "You're better off not singing anymore. Your voice has changed, forget it." So I did, I forgot it. And I took coursework in place of singing. Instead of choir, I took a course in woodworking. Mr. Khan and Mr. RJ were the two teachers of the show, of the course. Mr. Khan was the head guy, and he taught us how to deal with equipment, how to hold the equipment, how to take care of it, what to do with it, what it did, taught us how to use a vise, how to put wood in and how to cut it, how to connect it. I decided one day that I was going to disassemble a plane, and I did that, and he walked around and he found it disassembled, and he said, "Now that you disassembled it, assemble it." I couldn't assemble it. I got in trouble. He said, "Next time you do that, you do it and make sure you can reassemble it. Otherwise, they'll never do it. You're getting a bad mark for this one." So I didn't like a bad mark, but what the heck. It was only woodworking, it wasn't mathematics. While in that, on that school, that junior high school was called Clark Junior High School. In Clark Junior High School at the time, as well as all the schools in the city, there was no limitation as to use of communism in the school. And so communists were allowed to teach in the school. When I was in second half of the 7th grade, I was given a teacher who was an avowed communist. There were about 30 kids in our class, and his name was Lenny something. Anyhow, Lenny was a short guy. He was about 5'5" compared to almost everybody else. And one day, some of the seniors in the school had picked on some of the guys in our class. So he called the seniors into the classroom, and he said, "I heard you picked on a couple of our guys." And the seniors said, "They're just kids." And he slapped him across the face. And he said, "Oh, are you just a kid?" And he did that again. And then he said, "Come on, see if you can hit me now. Try and beat me up. I'm just a small kid too." Well, they wouldn't do it. Turns out he was a jiu-jitsu artist. And at that time, that was a big deal. But he also preached communism from his teacher desk. And at one point in time, using words like down with Christianity, uh, Christianity is the bunk, communism is the greatest. So after having heard that, and I was going to religious instruction on a regular basis at the Immaculate Conception Church. I heard that the Immaculate Conception School was accepting students. And so I applied, and I was accepted. Then I went home and told my mother, and she laughed. She said, "You didn't even tell me you wanted to go." I said, "I didn't know until I got there." So I went to the Immaculate Conception School and had brothers as my teachers, and it was a very good experience. When I became an 8th grader, I took an examination to go to the Catholic high schools, and I was passed and went to Cardinal Hayes High School. Cardinal Hayes High School was a very interesting place to be at. When I walked in with my mother, she said to the principal, "I know there's a tuition, but I can only afford $5. And he said, $5 a month is more than enough. And he said, "And if you have any other sons that want to come to Cardinal Hayes, you can do that. It'll only be $5 for one family, $5, no matter how many sons." It was a boys' school. Cardinal Hayes still is there, still a boys' school, still taking care of poor kids, teaching them how to live their lives. I enjoyed Cardinal Hayes. I didn't do music in Cardinal Hayes, even though there was music to be had, because I was working all those times. I think I mentioned that I worked at the tail. I don't know if I mentioned I worked also as a painter's helper. And I became a painter's helper during the time I was a air raid messenger, because the landlord, where the air raid messengers meeting hall was he was right there, so he knew the messengers and he accepted them. So he accepted me as one of his helpers, and I learned how to paint. It was a very interesting little piece. In 1952, I graduated from Manhattan College. I got a bachelor's degree in business administration. I had gone to Manhattan College as the result of working in the Standard Oil, where one of the captains had suggested I go to college. I went to Manhattan College, and it was a little bumpy road for a period of time. A couple of the teachers did not really connect with me, or I didn't connect with them. But ultimately, I was able to make my way through. I graduated with 144 credits. I felt very proud of that. But it opened the door to me for business administration, for an understanding of how to run businesses, how to keep them going, and how to clean them up. In 20 years after I graduated with a bachelor's degree, I determined that it was time for me to get a master's degree. So in 1973, I began a program. I asked Dolores if I could do that because she was going to be home with the 12 kids while I was doing that. She told me she'd give me 2 years. Well, I began the 2 years, and it was moving along, but at a year and a half, or a little bit less than that, I realized that a year and a half was even more than enough, that she would have too many other problems, so I couldn't let that happen. So I accelerated the program. And the day that I finished, at a year and a half, I completed my master's degree at New York Institute of Technology. The interesting thing was, the system at that time was if you went to school, you got more credit, you got a raise in salary. Well, because I had my master's degree, my raise in salary was equivalent to my tuition in getting a master's degree. So in the first year, I paid off my tuition, and from there on out, I got that as a part of my regular salary. It worked out very well. But during my college career, I went to the various dances that they had. They had what were known as tea dances. And so I went to the tea dances, and I would meet girls and whatever, and I danced with them. I only had one girl that I had some interest in, but she didn't have that much interest in me, so we kind of called that one off. But while doing that, I also went to dances from the that were close to the A&P. One of the guys named Tony, who was my age, working in the A&P, he was a career A&P man. I was a temporary, but we became friends. He said, let's go to St. Philip Neri on Sunday. They have dances there. I said, why we do that? He said, because they have girls. I said, oh. So I went to the dance with him. And the way it worked in St. Philip Neri was the girls stood on the side if they didn't know the guys, and the guys would go ask them for dances. And so there I was, and I had asked a couple girls to dance, but then I saw this girl, the blonde girl, looked pretty cute. So I went over, I asked her. So she said, okay, so we started to dance. I asked her her name, and she said Lois. I said, oh, like Superman's Lois. She said, yes, are you Superman? I said, absolutely. So I told her my name was Sam, and we connected very, very nicely. And she gave me her phone number, right? And at the end of the night, she went home with her friends, right? And the next Sunday, I went back. Well, I had gotten so busy, I forgot completely to call her. I go walking in. We went back to St. Philip Neri again. Oh, it was wonderful. All the girls there, whatever. And there's Lois. And she says, oh, how are you, Superman? And I said, I'm okay. And how are you? She said, you never call me. I said, I was too busy. She said, yeah, like hell. So we danced, we laughed, we had a good time. She went home with her friends, I went home. The next night, she had told me that on Monday nights, she always went to a novena in the church. The novena was at 8 o'clock. And since I was a pretty religious guy, I figured, maybe I'll just go to novena and God will bless me and I'll meet Lois there. Well, sure enough, I went to St. Francis of Rome, which was where the novena was. That was on 236th Street. She lived at 235th Street near White Plains Avenue, and I lived on 242nd Street, just off White Plains Avenue. So I walked out from my house to the church, and at 8 o'clock, I go walking in, and she's sitting there on the right, about 10 rows back. And I go in, and I tap her on the shoulder. I said, would you move in, please? So, sat down, and we became acquainted then, and we continued to do various things. She had another boyfriend, right? And I told her that he would be around only till the end of the year, but I'd be around a long time. Lois and I got very, very close. And so she invited me to her home to meet her family. I had been to her home before, which was an apartment house on 235th Street in the Bronx. And I had picked her up to take her out on a date, and I met her mother and father, but then I got to know them a little bit better. Her father worked in Wall Street. He was not an immigrant, but he was the son of an immigrant. His father, Stefano, had come over from Italy in the early 1900s, and John was born about 1917 or 18. That was her father. Uh, Her mother, Margaret, was not an immigrant, and her parents were not immigrants either. Her father was a French Canadian, and her mother was a local Irish lady who came from the Curry clan. They were all very pleasant. They did not have immigrant background or activities. Her father had a steady job. Her mother worked at home to take care of her as she was being raised. And so Lois's mother, Margaret, was a child of typical American family at the time. Lois's father was a son who had one brother, both of whom were children of immigrant parents. His father was named Stefano, and he was a Mason. Now, Stefano was 5 foot at most, had hands of steel, because as a Mason you needed that, and had the sweetest disposition. Even though he didn't speak English well, he spoke enough to be able to understand, and still was a lot of fun. John DeSanto's brother was named Tony. Tony was married to Helen, and they owned another apartment, a 2-family house on 227th Street, the Bronx, right down the block from Louis, who was a famous Italian restaurant, especially made famous in the Godfather 2 movie, where Michael Corleone did some work. And some of you may remember that. Lois's mother and father lived in this apartment house on 235th Street with her sister and brother, John and Claire. John was a few years older than she, and Claire was a few years younger. As they proceeded along the line, John went off to Manhattan College, and I just happened to be at Manhattan College a few years after that because he was a couple of years older than me. And Lois, Claire, went to Marymount College. The family was a typical family of the time. They seemed to be enjoying, what life was all about, had anxieties as most people have, but still were able to function reasonably well. John, the father, had angina, and ultimately that killed him about 1965 or thereabouts. Margaret developed cancer of the intestines, and she ultimately passed away, but that was only after Lois and I were married. Lois and I got married on February the 2nd, 1953. I had been working in General Electric, and she had been working in the Workers' Compensation Rating Board, and so we got married. We still worked close together. It was an interesting wedding because we first were engaged at Mayor's Parkway Restaurant, where I had the waiter bring a ring to her under a little cover, and that was interesting, little romantic kind of stuff. When we were married, we had a reception at Mayor's Parkway Restaurant, and so that was very nice. And we had about 150 people, mostly relatives, some friends, but it was primarily relatives because we both had reasonable sized families. After we landed in Idlewild, coming back from Bermuda, we went to the baggage area, and who did we meet but Lois's mother and father? They were there ready, waiting for us. They were going to drive us home, which was very nice. So we put our baggage in. They drove us home. They gave us the key to our apartment, and they left. And we went into the apartment, which was a basement apartment in Uncle Tony and Aunt Helen's two-family house on 227th Street. The basement apartment had been constructed by her grandfather, Stefano, who was very good at that stuff. And so he had fashioned an apartment out of what otherwise had been a storage basement. 3-room apartment, lovely. So we went in, and what do we find in the refrigerator? Stocked with food. More food than you could shake a stick at. So we went in, we spent our first night there. Next morning we get up. Lois makes the next morning is a Monday morning because we came back on a Sunday, and I have to go to work on the Monday morning. Of course, I looked in my pocket and I didn't have any money, so that was a little sticky. But before that happened, Lois made me this wonderful breakfast. I mean, pancakes, eggs, sausage. It just was absolutely fabulous. Of course, being kind of a dumb guy at the time, I said to her, I never eat breakfast. Well, that was devastating because her initial statement was, well, that's okay. I'll never make you breakfast again. So, and for years, she never did. I went to work. I got paid that morning. Now I had money. Oh, it was wonderful. I was able to go to Needix, or not the Needix, the Horn and Hardouts. I took my quarters and put it in the machine. I got all that food. My friends, Sherry and Jay, went with me. We had a good time yakking about that. Well, that night I went home. Lois did have a wonderful dinner for me. I did like dinner. I didn't get breakfast the next morning or ever again, but that was okay. She and I rode to work from then on together because she still worked on the block and so did I. That was in March. We got back in February. In March, we were working together. That kept going on until near the end of the year when she became pregnant. And she and I decided we had to change apartments. My mother-in-law, Margaret, knew that there was an apartment in her apartment house that was available. It was on the first floor, or the second floor, first floor up, and that if we wanted it, she could probably arrange for it. Well, she did. She arranged for it. The landlord opened it up for us, painted the place, and we moved into that apartment. It was really a very nice apartment, big. I had 2 bedrooms, a very big living room, a nice dining room. I mean, it was a big place. So we moved in, and we lived right next door to Esther. Esther was Red Button's sister. Red Buttons was an actor at the time, a really funny guy, and he was well known. His sister was as dynamic as he was. Lois and I had 6 children. The first one was Susan. We had her in 1954. She was a very cute one, blonde hair. She liked to talk. From the time she was born, and I guess she still is, but let me tell you, she was the loud one. But Susan was named Susan Mary Donato. Now, Susan was a name that Lois picked out. I didn't insist upon any names for any children. I confirmed that if she liked Susan, that's what it was going to be, or Kathy, or any of the others. But the name Mary was one that we used because we were dedicated to the Blessed Mother of Jesus. So Mary became the second name. When Catherine was born, Catherine was named by Lois again, but she thought of her Aunt Catherine, who was a very sweet lady. The difference between the two was Aunt Catherine was spelled with a C and our Catherine was spelled with a K. Well, that was the only differential. They were both sweet people. Aunt Catherine was a very sharp lady, very capable in her own right. We then had Stephen. Now, Stephen was named after Saint Stephen, but also after Lois's grandfather, Stephen, whose name was Stefano. So when she said to me, Stephen, I said, fine, it fit very well. It's Stephen Andrew. Andrew is an apostle. And since I wanted to have a saintly middle name, and I wanted to have one that would to some degree parallel me, we named him Stephen Andrew. Well, his name was S.A.D., his initials the same as mine. And it has followed him throughout his life because he's always been a very happy kid. The next one was Thomas. Thomas, there were two Thomases, both saints, apostles, and Joseph, the father of Jesus. That's how he was named. We then had Matthew John. Matthew John was Matthew and John, both gospel writers, and we liked that. We thought that was very good. It was appropriate. And then we had Elizabeth Mary Hope. Elizabeth was, from time that Lois was pregnant, was having difficulty in utero. And so the doctor, whose name was Irma Hope Rivera, worked with Lois throughout the pregnancy up until the time of the birth of Beth. And so we thought, since she was so instrumental, we would add her name, Hope, into Beth's name. So it became Elizabeth Mary Hope Donato. All of a sudden, we had 6 children, and we were living in this new house, and we were just overjoyed. It was difficult because I had never realized that the bigger the house, the size of the bigger the expenses. So I took on a part-time job in addition to the school district job. Since I had just moved into the school district and gotten a cut in pay, it was kind of difficult to handle the finances. So what I did was I got a part-time job with the Star Credit Company. And since I had learned how to do collections when I was with General Electric Credit Corporation, I put that expertise to work and was doing pretty well with that. That was starting in October of 1966. In January of 1967, Lois announced to me that she and Pat Bueller, her friend, who were co-chairpeople of the Girl Scouts in the local area, were going to raise funds for a trip to Puerto Rico. They insisted that I help them in raising the funds because I had done some fundraising before. And so I went around the community and raised funds, helped them with it. Of course, they raised funds as well. All the kids who were going to Puerto Rico raised funds as well. And they told me that I was I had broken the record for fundraising for the Girl Scouts at that point. And I felt overjoyed with that, except that it meant that Lois, Susan, Kathy, Pat Bueller, and Mary Kay, her daughter, were all going off to Puerto Rico and leaving me at home with the rest of the kids. But that was fun anyhow. So Lois went off to Puerto Rico with the kids and with Pat Bueller and came back. I met them at the airport, Idlewild Airport, And she gave me a big hug and a kiss, and she said, "Now I can die peacefully. I've been to Puerto Rico." That was approximately in the month of March or April, 1966. 3 months later, she died. She became ill at the beginning of June, had problems with her varicose veins, thromboses were developing. The doctor, uh, the uh, the vascular doctor, asked her or suggested that she go to the hospital for treatment and rest. She did that. And on June the 22nd, uh, I called her on the phone before visiting her. I was at work and I was going to see her at the hospital at lunchtime. And she said that she had been told by the doctor she now could get out of bed and go to, she had bathroom privileges. And so that was fine. So I went to the hospital and saw her. We talked a little bit, and then I went back to work. On the way back to work, I had to make a few stops. And when I go walking in the office, my secretary, Eleanor Stitchway, says to me, "I just got a call from the hospital. They need you there." I went there, and she was suffering. Lois was suffering with an embolism that had shot from her leg into her heart. And she was dying literally before my eyes. The doctors at that point in time did not know how to handle that. Their medicine had not proceeded to a point where they were either able to give her blood thinner or do anything else to get her past that point. That afternoon, she died. It was a sorry passing, to say the least. I'm there in the hospital room, and they said, well, they will now, do what is appropriate for a dead person. They would take care of that. My mother-in-law was coming to the hospital. She was going to go visit. I said, I need a few minutes. So I retired into a little quiet room for about 15 minutes, thought about what I had to do and whatever, knowing I had 6 children that I no longer had a mother for them. And so I determined that I had to get things going. I went out, and my mother-in-law arrived on the scene. She was hysterical. Her daughter dying, a daughter who had given her 6 grandchildren, and this devastated her. She was devastated, and then Father Hagen walked in, who was a priest, a local priest in Corpus Christi Church, where I was a member of the parish. And he suggested a couple of things. He gave me a little guidance as to how to handle the wake and what to do with the wake, which was very helpful. And so we proceeded for a one-day wake and a burial. Losing Lois was traumatizing, to say the least. I knew that the children would be totally traumatized. Susan was at home, so when I got home and I spoke to her, she was hysterical, to say the least. But she pulled herself together very quickly because she realized we had 4 other children here who could not understand the impact of that. Kathy was with my mother in New Jersey. She had gone there to stay there for a couple of days. So when I called there, both my mother and Kathy were also devastated. This was on June the 22nd, right after the close of school. It was a very tough day, to say the least. We had the funeral, we had the wake. I had a couple of friends who, at that point, helped me in making the arrangements. I got a burial plot in Holy Rood Cemetery, which is not too far away from where I live, which made it possible to make visitation from time to time. And on the day of the funeral, we had all the kids together. We were in the church, which was the old church, which subsequently was torn down. Cute little church. The priest, Father Joe DeSanto, who was Lois's cousin, had come in from Westchester to say the Mass. He did that. The whole family was there. Lois's mother rode with me and with the 4 older children to the cemetery. The 2 younger children, Matt and Beth, were just a little too young to accommodate that. On our way to the cemetery, Tommy, who was the youngest of the 4, turned to me and said, "Daddy, are we going to have a new mommy?" And Lois's mother said, "Well, we'll just have to see about that." Words that later on in life I realized were very meaningful and I used often times. We buried Lois in Holy Rood Cemetery, got a marker. The marker was not a very big one, a small one. Sedate, the kind of thing Lois would have liked. We put it there, and it's still there. After we buried Lois, we went back home. It was time for us to get our act together, move forward. It was summer because she died on June the 22nd, and the kids were going to be home until September. Grandma DeSanto and Aunt Catherine Muller came over at least once or twice a week to help us through that period of time of adjustment, which was very helpful. In September, I began transporting Beth and Matt to my mother's house every week. I drove them there on Sunday, picked them up on Friday. She lived in Kenilworth, New Jersey, which was about an hour and a half away. So every Friday after work, I'd pick them up and I'd drive there. I'd go to Kenilworth, pick them up and bring them home. I didn't want them to be away from their brothers and sisters for any length of time, but always in the care and custody of my mother or Lois's mother, one way or the other. And so that continued on for a whole year. While that was going on, I was working, spending time at home with the kids, getting to know each of my children better than I ever did before. And I realized that Susan was taking over almost immediately, and I had to be careful of that because I was always aware of the fact that children that are left without a parent sometimes get totally disrupted in their living and never get back on track. And so I was very wary about that fact. But she was very good and very helpful. And Kathy was always by her side helping her with whatever needed to be done.